Good evening and welcome to yet another one-hour edition of Left, Right and Centre with me, Sanket Upadhyay. Our top story, the first story, the Prime Minister is in the United States. He has lots of meetings. He met the CEOs today. He's going to meet Vice President Kamala Harris, and then later, of course, the Quad meeting, then the bilateral with Joe Biden, his first face-to-face meeting with Joe Biden, and then his address at the UNGA. Now, the biggest concern first, of all the countries India is going to speak to, we are the ones who are neighbours to an Afghanistan in the grip of Taliban rule, a terror-promoting Pakistan, and a China the world wants to counter economically, with whom we share our borders. Who do we talk to? What should be our strategy? How much do we trust the United States of America, which has faced criticism for the manner in which the pullout happened in Afghanistan? They very recently abandoned the French, and they were really mighty upset about it over someone else getting nuked submarines. At the UNGA, will the Prime Minister push for UN reforms? We put all these points to a discussion and ask the most basic question. What do we hope to achieve at the end of these 2 or 3 days, and why does this matter so much? The Prime Minister in the United States, what really should we realistically expect of this visit? I have with me Brahma Chelani, is a security expert. Joining us, Richard M. Russo, a Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies, the Center of Strategic and International Studies. Raymond Vickery, Senior Advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group. In just a short moment, we'll have Nish Acharya, current advisor on the Biden infrastructure plan, and Anita Powell, White House correspondent of the Voice of America. Thank you very much. Important discussion. We begin with you, Mr. Russo. First things first. What can one realistically expect of this meeting?
Well, some of the agenda is shared, and some of it are the two sides that have individual issues to bring up. I think for India, they would like more clarity on what's going to happen once they take possession of these Russian missile systems, and is there going to be application of CAATSA sanctions? They would like to press the United States to ease up pressure a little bit on some of the trade pressures that we put on, some of the new trade impositions, which are a reaction to some of India's own protectionisms. But still, Modi's Make in India campaign, part of that relies on local content and things. When we think about as well access to advanced technologies, may push Biden as well on things like UN reforms, as you mentioned. 2 U.S. presidents in a row have talked about trying to make reforms that would give India a seat at the table permanently at the UN Security Council. For the Biden administration, they'll talk about climate. They'd like to see India make substantive commitments. And so I think both sides have a number of issues, some of which are shared and some of which are going to involve some real tough negotiations over the next 24 hours.
That's right. Mr. Brahma Chelani, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, India has real terror concerns. I mean, you saw a consignment coming in from Afghanistan, which was seized by the authorities of the Mundra port in Gujarat, which was drugs coming in from Afghanistan into the country. We have terror concerns also. Narco-terrorism is a huge concern in the country. But what can one reasonably expect of these meetings in terms of substantial assurances?
What has happened in Afghanistan clearly has compounded, if not compromised, India's security interests. And nothing can undo the damage to India's security interests that has been inflicted by America's abject capitulation to a terrorist militia in Afghanistan. In fact, the Biden administration now appears not only reconciled to terrorists ruling Afghanistan, but also it is seeking to woo the Taliban as a new partner in quote-unquote counterterrorism, to quote Secretary of State Tony Blinken. Now, this underscores why the global war on terror has gone off the rails. The terrorists in charge of Kabul clearly are a threat to Afghans, to countries in the neighborhood, especially India, but they also pose a threat to global security. And this handover of a mineral-rich country to a band of medieval thugs is going to come back and haunt American security sooner or later.
Okay.
Hello, I can't hear anything.
Right. Mr. Raymond Vickery, I want to come to you now. As far as economic cooperation is concerned, obviously one of the concerns that everybody has is how China is using or exerting its influence overtly and covertly to propel itself as an economic power. Now, being an economic power itself is not the problem. The manner in which it is being done may be the problem. Whether it is Pakistan, Afghanistan or China, it is India right at the center of this. While the world ponders on what their strategy should be, what do you think can be an India-centered or India-centric policy to take on China? Mr. Raymond, can you hear me? Okay, it seems Mr. Raymond is not being able to hear me. I'm going to try once again. Mr. Raymond Vickery, can you hear me? I'm going to go back to him in just a short moment. But Mr. Richard Russo, let me ask you this question. Do you think that a comprehensive India-centric strategy, because for the world to take on China in whichever form, it is very interesting and important for them to keep India at the center, because this is a country right here as opposed to other countries who are across the globe.
Well, that's India's perspective, and it's certainly not wrong. But countries across the East Asia and the Pacific and South China Sea, they've got just as much, if not more, direct pressures being applied by China on a daily basis, and less ability themselves individually to push back. So the leaders constantly talk about ASEAN centrality. We know that ASEAN institution has had a difficult time taking two steps together in one direction. So you've got some countries, like Vietnam, that certainly is willing to voice its concerns and push back against China, and other smaller nations that are being courted actively by China, or some like Philippines that are being overridden by China. So, ASEAN, you actually see different reactions by individual members. So India's threats are very real. I think in Washington, we're only sort of becoming apprised. There's a greater awareness of the border threat because of the recent flare-ups. Less, I think, understanding of the maritime threats India faces, but that's slowly been increasing, in large part due to your government's active measures to widen the aperture of the Indo-Pacific, to be a little heavier on the Indo. So, from the U.S. perspective, India certainly isn't the only country that faces these kind of pressures. And in fact, across the East Asia, they may be a little bit further along in terms of the damage. But India is emerging as a place that I think the American security establishment pay a lot more attention, both maritime and border. So it's growing in Americans' eyes, too.
Yes, Mr. Raymond, I'm being told, is now back with us. Mr. Raymond, this question was originally for you, and I was asking that when one goes for a strategy to counter China, you're obviously doing that from a distance. The problem that one sees here in India is that here is a country which is seeing China's might in Sri Lanka, China's might to the left of our borders, to the right of our borders. In Afghanistan, it is exerting itself, and we share a border with China. So do you think that a global strategy, whether it is on the economic front or otherwise, has to keep India at the very focus?
Sorry, but I'm not getting any audio.
Can you hear me? Mr. Raymond, can you hear me? Okay, this seems to be a terrible problem with his audio connection. We apologize to our viewers. Mr. Brahmachelani, I want to come to you now. You see, as far as the Quad is concerned, there is India, there is Australia, there is US, and there is Japan. All these countries, including India, continue to do business with China. Now, I'm not saying snap ties, economic ties with China, but we did see that in the peak of the Galwan crisis, we tried to do as much as tough talking as possible with Chinese. How do you think you can contain when all these countries of the Quad will continue to do business with China and then sit and deliberate what our policy to counter China is going to be?
Well, no one is arguing for snapping ties with China. Normal trade relationships are fine. Even enemy nations historically have traded. The issue is how to rein in China's expansionism. Like Nazi Germany, Xi Jinping's China is on an expansionist mode. The question is, how do we rein in China? How do we put discrete checks on China's behavior? In this context, it's important to remember, and I think this is the point that you were trying to make, Sanket, to the earlier panelists, that none of the countries that formed this new AUKUS alliance, none of them borders China. None of them faces a direct threat from that communist giant. In fact, in terms of military strategy, the US military strategy is a maritime-based strategy, while India's primary security threats are land-based, both from China and from Pakistan, and now from Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. So there is a fundamental divergence in terms of the pressures that China applies, as well as on the military dimensions. The Quad was a Trump administration project. They resurrected the Quad. They gave it strategic meaning. And President Biden, ever since he took office, has been seeking to abandon the policies and programs of the Trump administration. He took 4 months to embrace the Quad after he got elected. And now through this AUKUS deal, he's basically relegating Quad or making it secondary to the AUKUS partnership. The AUKUS partnership may be significant, but like the 2005 US-India nuclear deal, it will bear fruit in the long term. After all, as the Australian Prime Minister Morrison has said, the first Australian-made nuclear-powered submarine will not be ready before 2040. That is almost 2 decades by now, by which time the Indo-Pacific landscape could have tilted heavily in China's favor. Because the China threat is a pressing threat. We need to find concrete countermeasures against that threat. And just like the way the US-India nuclear deal was hyped, the AUKUS deal is being hyped. And if you take the hype aside and look at the contents of the AUKUS deal, it actually raises some fundamental questions about Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy. There is still no clarity on that Indo-Pacific strategy.
Sure.
The Trump administration handed the Biden administration a clear-headed Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's been, what, now 8 months that the Biden administration has been in office. What we have is this new AUKUS partnership. That's only one component in the larger.
Which brings me to my next question, which I want to ask Ms. Anita Powell. Ms. Powell, you see, Americans have upset a lot of its allies. They've abandoned Afghanistan as being claimed by many in Afghanistan fighting for their rights and civil liberty. They've upset the French by way of this AUKUS deal that Brahma Chelani was talking about. Can America be treated as a trusted ally as far as India is concerned?
Posed to President Biden in their closed-door talks today. It is true that the AUKUS deal has kind of overshadowed this Quad meeting, and it's important to note that yesterday on the White House podium, Press Secretary Jen Psaki noted that this is a one-off deal. Only Australia is going to be a beneficiary of this kind of technology from the U.S., which does raise questions about India's involvement in security in the Indo-Pacific. But that is not something that we're likely to hear from the podium or from the pleasantries exchanged between these leaders. That's probably going to be happening behind closed doors.
Okay. Nish Acharya also, I believe, is now with us. Nish Acharya, we've seen infrastructure being spoken about a lot as a key area of partnership in various administrations in the United States. During the Obama administration, I'm talking about a partnership with India. During the Obama administration, then in the Trump administration, which was obviously politically different, for the US, and now again in the Biden administration. What do you see? Where do you see the roadmap, and how will it play out?
The big difference between previous administrations is that there's actually legislation now for the infrastructure development. So a $1 trillion bill that's actually passing it through Congress right now and hopefully become law this fall. And what that means for the U.S.-India relationship, I think, is that there'll be a lot of opportunity on sustainable technology, things related to climate change, which is quickly becoming one of the top 2 or 3 issues where U.S. and India can collaborate. So I think there'll be less issues about intellectual property there and more opportunity for technologies jointly developed in terms of batteries, in terms of sustainable energy sources, all of those sorts of things that can be leveraged for the U.S. infrastructure and then hopefully lead to cooperation on the India side. So I think it's a big opportunity in terms of climate tech for India-U.S.
Okay, Raymond Vickery, I believe, is now back with us. Let me ask him, Mr. Vickery, can you hear me? Mr. Raymond?
I can hear you fine now. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. We've been trying really hard, and finally we have you on the show. Let me start by asking you a relatively easy question so that we don't lose you again. Mr. Raymond, my question to you is that this cooperation, economic cooperation between US and India, where do you see it going from here on? I mean, of course, it was talked about a lot during the Trump administration. The Trump administration was seen as a friendly administration as far as India is concerned. Between Joe Biden and Narendra Modi, do you think that they can really work together, some sort of an economic strategy which will propel us into maybe the next orbit?
Well, I have no doubt that they can work together. And the good news from Washington, D.C. is that this is one of the few subjects which has bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans, starting with President Bill Clinton, going through President Bush, through President Obama and President Trump, have really all been singing the same message in terms of the strength of the U.S.-India relationship. Now, what's needed in order to be able to make reality out of this, and this is where the Quad can really come in, is the economic, the infrastructure, the development kind of aspect to the relationship between these 4 great democracies. So I think it can be done, but there's going to have to be a lot of work because, as has been pointed out, there's been a lot of talk over a number of years about infrastructure development to meet the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And unless we can come together and put some money behind it, it isn't going to amount to a hill of beans. So I think that this first in-person Quad meeting is very important for all of the soft power, whether it be the infrastructure development, what happens in vaccine diplomacy, what happens in terms of supply chains. And I don't think it's any secret that there's a lot to be overcome because there's protectionism, which is rampant, both in India and in the United States. You can call it whatever you want, America first, make in India, whatever. But these kinds of impediments have to be addressed at the highest level. And that's something that the Quad
Yes, but
can
you know,
really
Mr. Vickery, since you mentioned this, I would like to highlight that there is a difference between American and British protectionism as far as vaccines is concerned, and a scheme which perhaps I would like to make you aware of, which is called Vaccine Maitri. Maitri in English will mean friendship. As a part of that initiative, India is also giving out vaccines to the rest of the world. It could not because of production issues, but it is resuming that come this October. So there is a very different approach as far as vaccines is concerned. One of protectionism in the US, and on the other in India, where you've got a country saying, we'll give it to the rest of the world as part of our responsibility.
Well, I think that that's where President Biden has made a great contribution because he has pledged to turn around the policy of not providing vaccine to the developing nations of the world. And I think that you're going to find that the kind of pledges that he made at the United Nations are going to bear fruit in regard to the Quad meeting. So this is a difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and I think it augurs very well. But India doesn't have completely clean hands on this. The fact is that the stoppage of exporting of vaccines from India was not just a production issue. It was a political issue. And that was at the height of the second wave. India, like others, said, well, maybe we better see only about ourselves first. So this has to be overcome on both sides, and I think that that's why you have the leaders at the highest level who can make progress on it.
But, you know, don't blame me for being Indian and thinking about India first, but the point is, when you've got a crisis at home, you're not going to think of providing your lifeline to someone else. You'll first try to save your life, and putting the interests of India first, I don't think necessarily means a bad policy, because that's exactly what any other self-respecting country in the world will also do, just like the United States. But perhaps now is the time to open this up, and to that effect, I think you're making sense. Anita Powell, you know, this whole point on vaccine diplomacy, do you think that this can play a major role going forward in easing or soothing some of these frayed nerves that led to a lot of inhibition, trouble, frustration, deliberation between various countries? I mean, vaccine opening up diplomacy for other things also.
Yes, what I can tell you is that that is likely to factor high in the agenda between both the Vice President and Prime Minister Modi, and also between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. And that's because yesterday the press secretary said that the Quad is going to try to produce 1 billion vaccines. And as we know, the largest vaccine manufacturing facility in the world is in India. They cannot do it without India's assistance, without India's manpower, womanpower, whatever you want to call it. So that is definitely going to open up some avenues for cooperation and diplomacy in a way that I think both leaders are going to agree with, that the developing world needs vaccines. They need them with no strings attached, and India is in a position to provide that, to give the muscle to that dream. And I think that's something that's going to be at the front of these discussions.
All right. Brahmachelani, I want to quickly come back to you and ask you a very important question on what the Prime Minister may talk about at the UNGA. This is something which the Prime Minister has spoken about in the past also, and this is something which needs to be addressed globally. Reforms in the United Nations. How important do you think this point is? And can India steer the ship as far as UN reforms are concerned?
Well, the reforms of the UN are very important, but let me very quickly refer to the question that you asked earlier about vaccine diplomacy.
Yeah, sure.
Often summit declarations don't translate into real action, and yet we tend to focus on the pronouncements between two leaders or the declarations from a summit. For example, this is the second Quad summit this year. The first Quad summit was held in March. It was a virtual summit, but the most important thing that emerged from that Quad summit was a vaccine initiative that Biden proposed. What has happened to it? Biden has failed to concretize that vaccine initiative. For example, there was so much hype about Johnson & Johnson signing an agreement with India's biological E. The agreement has not even materialized so far. And more importantly, Biden has failed to provide strategic direction on consolidating the Quad. Instead, he has unveiled this new alliance, which is casting a shadow over the future of the Quad. But turning to the UN, two things are happening. One, the UN is getting increasingly marginalized in international relations. That is apparent both from the most pressing public health issue that the world faces, the pandemic. The UN has played no role really in the pandemic. And we've also seen in relation to Afghanistan how marginalized the UN has become. But the UN will not reform, unfortunately. The reform issue has been on the UN agenda for decades, since the time I was a kid. Even the UN Security Council reform has gone nowhere. For a country like India, which represents 18% of humanity, there's absolutely no prospect of India ever becoming a veto-carrying permanent member of the UN Security Council. So India has to think hard about its own role in the UN. Should it continue to invest in that organization? Or should it think afresh? This is an important issue that you've raised.
That's right. And, the Prime Minister has addressed this concern in the past also. Let's see if he's going to raise this again and whether the world is going to come around this very, very important fact. Thank you very much. In fact, there's some coup questions also on the coup app. We asked this, what can one realistically achieve as far as this meeting is concerned. Rafi says, can this meeting help us to prevent China's threat? I think that has been largely answered by all our guests. And what will be the outcome of this summit? Will there be any permanent solution to all the agendas?